The deafening roar of Apache escorts and heavily armored Black Hawk transport choppers rattled the reinforced safety glass of Sacred Heart Medical Center. Inside the usually chaotic trauma center, time stopped. Coffee spilled over the rims of styrofoam cups, and seasoned surgeons froze in their tracks. Yet it wasn't the fleet of 8 military helicopters descending upon a civilian parking lot that paralyzed the emergency room staff. It was the sight of heavily armed, blood-soaked Special Forces operatives sprinting through the automatic doors, ignoring the chief of medicine, and snapping a crisp salute to the stuttering, notoriously clumsy new triage nurse. "Angel 6, the lead commando barked, his voice cracking with raw desperation. "We need you." Sacred Heart Medical Center, nestled in the damp, unforgiving coastal grip of Portland, Oregon, was a facility that thrived on controlled chaos. Its emergency department was a relentless revolving door of human misery. Particularly on a Friday night in late November, the fluorescent lights hummed with a sickly, pale intensity, casting long, exhausted shadows beneath the eyes of the medical staff. The scent of the air was a permanent, sterile cocktail of industrial bleach, copper, spilled cheap coffee, and the faint, unmistakable, underlying odor of iodine and despair. Into this localized hurricane stepped Abigail Foster. She was the newest addition to the nursing staff, and by all outward appearances, she was entirely unremarkable. Abigail was a woman who seemed to actively apologize for taking up physical space. She wore scrubs that were consistently 2 sizes too large, a faded seafoam green that completely swallowed her frame. Her hair, a nondescript shade of mousy brown, was perpetually tied back in a messy, uneven bun, held together by cheap plastic clips. Heavy, thick-rimmed glasses rested low on the bridge of her nose, often slipping down when she was flustered, which, according to the staff, was an almost constant state of being. From her first week on the floor, the consensus among the Sacred Heart veterans was unanimous. Abigail was a liability. She was timid, her voice rarely rising above a nervous whisper. She dropped clipboards, fumbled with basic IV tubing, and seemed to shrink whenever someone raised their voice. In the high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled environment of Level 1 trauma, weakness was blood in the water, and the sharks were always circling. Dr. Kyle Braxton was the loudest of those sharks. A second-year attending physician with a jawline carved from marble and an ego inflated to match, Braxton viewed the ER as his personal kingdom and the nurses as his indentured servants. He was a brilliant diagnostician, a fact he ensured everyone was acutely aware of, but his bedside manner was non-existent, and his patience for newcomers was less than 0. "Foster!" Braxton's voice cracked like a whip across the crowded central nurses' station. "I asked for the chem panel on bed 4 10 minutes ago. Are you individually drawing the blood cells with a crayon in the lab?" Abigail jumped, her elbow clipping a stack of blank admission forms, sending a cascade of white paper fluttering to the linoleum floor. "I'm sorry, Dr. Braxton," she stammered, her cheeks flushing a deep, embarrassing crimson. She dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather the papers, her oversized scrubs bunching around her ankles. "The lab system was buffering, and I didn't want to give you incomplete. I don't need excuses, I need data," Braxton snapped, stepping over her aggressively to grab a chart from the rack. "If you can't handle a simple basic metabolic panel, how are you going to handle a crashing patient? Get it together, or get out of my trauma bay." Nancy Gable, the veteran charge nurse, whose severe, iron-grey bob matched her no-nonsense personality, watched the exchange with a tight-lipped scowl. Once Braxton had stormed off towards the double doors of Trauma 1, Nancy walked around the desk and knelt beside Abigail, helping her gather the last of the forms. "You have to stop letting him walk all over you, Abby," Nancy said, her voice softening just a fraction. "He smells fear. You're fully licensed. You passed the boards. Act like it." "I know, Nancy," Abigail whispered, pushing her thick glasses up her nose with a trembling index finger. "It's just the noise. It's very loud here. I'm still adjusting to the pace." Nancy sighed, handing over the stack of papers. "Take bed 6. Simple laceration. Drunk college kid tried to open a beer bottle with a broken window. Just clean it, prep it for sutures, and don't let Braxton see you crying. I'm not crying, Abigail said softly, keeping her eyes glued to the floor as she scurried away toward curtain number 6. From the corner of the station, Brenda Higgins, a junior nurse known more for her ability to spread rumors than her clinical skills, leaned over the counter. I give her 2 weeks, Brenda muttered, popping a piece of gum. She's a mouse, a grey, trembling little mouse. I looked at her file when Human Resources left it on the desk yesterday. Her last job was at some rural outpatient clinic in Wyoming. She's never seen real blood. She's going to wash out the second a major multi-system trauma rolls through those doors. But if Brenda or Nancy had looked closely, truly closely, they might have noticed the profound discrepancy in Abigail Foster's performance. They might have noticed that while she fumbled with clipboards and stumbled over her own words, her hands never trembled when she actually touched a patient. They might have observed the way her eyes, hidden behind those thick, distracting lenses, constantly scanned the emergency room, tracking the movement of every doctor, every patient, and every security guard with a cold mechanical precision. They might have seen that the heavy, clunky black boots she wore beneath her baggy scrubs were not standard orthopedic nursing shoes, but meticulously maintained tactical footwear. Abigail stepped into the cubicle of bed 6. The young man was intoxicated, belligerent, and bleeding profusely from a jagged tear across his forearm. As he thrashed, spraying droplets of blood onto the sterile drapes, Abigail's shoulders imperceptibly dropped. The nervous hunch vanished. In the span of 3 seconds, she stepped inside his guard, applied precise, agonizing pressure to a specific nerve bundle near his bicep, and immobilized his arm completely. The kid gasped, the fight instantly draining out of him. "Shh," Abigail murmured, her voice entirely stripped of its previous stutter, replaced by a smooth, terrifyingly calm cadence. "Hold perfectly still, and this won't hurt." Before the patient could process what had happened, she had the wound irrigated, packed, and perfectly prepped. The moment the curtain rustled, signaling an approaching doctor, Abigail instantly dropped her shoulders, widened her eyes, and knocked a plastic basin onto the floor with a loud clatter. Oh goodness, I'm so clumsy," she squeaked as Dr. Braxton walked in. "Just stand in the corner, Foster," Braxton groaned, rolling his eyes at the mess. "I'll take it from here." Abigail nodded meekly, stepping back into the shadows. The grey mouse had returned, perfectly hidden in plain sight. The relentless grind of the Friday night shift bled seamlessly into the early, bitter hours of Saturday morning. By 2 a.m., the initial rush of drunken bar fights and minor domestic accidents had given way to the heavy, grim realities of the witching hour. The air in the ER felt thicker, heavy with the exhaustion of the staff and the impending dread of what the police scanners were hinting at. A heavy fog had rolled off the Pacific, blanketing Portland in a thick, soupy grey that obscured the streetlights and made the wail of ambulance sirens sound hollow and distorted. Dr. Robert Callum stood near the centralized coffee station, nursing a cup of something that tasted like battery acid and burnt dirt. At 58, Callum was the chief of emergency medicine at Sacred Heart. He possessed the weary, deeply lined face of a man who had spent 3 decades watching human beings invent new and horrifying ways to destroy themselves and each other. He was a brilliant physician, but more importantly, he was an exceptional observer of human nature. You didn't survive 30 years in a level 1 trauma center without learning how to read the subtle, unspoken tells of the people around you. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his sharp, pale blue eyes tracking the movement across the floor. His gaze settled on Abigail Foster. She was currently being berated, again, by Dr. Braxton over a mislabeled urine sample. Callum watched as Abigail bowed her head, her posture a perfect portrait of submission and anxiety. But Callum frowned. Something about it was too perfect. He had seen thousands of terrified new nurses break under the pressure. They cried, they argued back, their hands shook, Their breathing grew shallow and erratic. Abigail did none of those things. Her breathing, Callum noticed with narrowed eyes, was incredibly slow and rhythmic. Even as Braxton yelled, her respiratory rate remained at a steady, calm 12 breaths per minute. It was the breathing of a sniper settling into a hide, not a panicked rookie. Suddenly, the red emergency phone on the main desk shrieked, slicing through the low murmur of the ER. Nancy Gable snatched it up. She listened for 5 seconds, her face draining of color. "Level 1 trauma, ETA 2 minutes," Nancy shouted, slamming the receiver down. The entire department shifted gears instantly. "We have a male, late 20s, multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen. BP is 70 over palpable, tachycardic at 140. He's crashing in the rig." "Trauma Bay 1, Braxton yelled, his arrogance momentarily replaced by the sharp focus of a physician about to fight for a life. "I need a chest tube tray, rapid infuser primed with ONEG, and someone page surgery right now." The bay became a flurry of synchronized movement. Nurses and techs flooded the room, tearing open sterile packaging and prepping equipment. Abigail hovered near the back, clutching a clipboard to her chest, looking terrified. The double doors smashed open. Paramedics rushed the gurney in, straddling the patient and delivering frantic chest compressions. The patient was a mess, pale, covered in blood, his chest rising and falling in unnatural, jagged spasms. "On my count, transfer," Braxton ordered. 1, 2, 3. They shifted the bloody mass onto the hospital bed. Braxton immediately took the head. "He's got a tension pneumothorax on the right side. Trachea is deviated. I need a needle decompression now. Give me a 14-gauge angiocath." Brenda slapped the needle into Braxton's hand. He leaned over the patient's chest, locating the second intercostal space. But Braxton was rushing. The adrenaline, combined with the sheer amount of blood slicking the patient's skin, caused his gloved hand to slip. He plunged the needle in, but the angle was slightly off. Instead of the satisfying hiss of escaping air, there was nothing. The patient's oxygen saturation monitor continued its deadly downward scream. "Damn it," Braxton swore, sweat beading on his forehead. "I hit the rib. Give me another one." He reached his hand out blindly. Brenda was frozen, panicked by the sudden failure. The monitor screamed louder. The patient was seconds away from cardiac arrest. From the back of the room, a blur of seafoam green moved. Abigail stepped forward. She didn't stumble. She didn't hesitate. In one fluid, hyper-efficient motion, she bypassed Brenda, grabbed a fresh 14-gauge needle from the tray, and stepped into the space next to Braxton. Before Braxton could even register her presence, Abigail's left hand flattened against the patient's bloody chest, her thumb and forefinger instantly isolating the exact anatomical landmark. Her right hand drove the needle in at a flawless, textbook 90-degree angle. A loud, sharp hiss of trapped air erupted from the plastic catheter. Instantly, the patient's chest deflated. The heart monitor's shrill tone shifted to a steady, rhythmic beep, and the oxygen saturation numbers began to climb. Abigail immediately let go of the needle, took 2 steps back, and violently bumped her hip against a rolling stainless steel tray, sending a box of latex gloves crashing to the floor. "Oh my gosh," she gasped, her voice shrill and trembling. "I'm so sorry. I tripped and I pushed your arm, Dr. Braxton. I'm so sorry." The room was completely silent, save for the rhythmic beeping of the monitor. Braxton stared at the needle protruding perfectly from the patient's chest. He looked down at his own empty hand, then back up at Abigail, who was currently cowering near the sink, adjusting her thick glasses. Ego is a powerful drug. Braxton's brain, unable to process that the clumsy new nurse had just flawlessly saved his patient while he choked, latched onto the excuse she so readily provided. "Watch where you're going, Foster," Braxton barked, masking his intense relief with anger. "You bumped my elbow. It's a miracle the needle went in the right place. Get out of here before you kill someone." "Yes, Doctor." "Sorry, Doctor," Abigail whimpered, fleeing the trauma bay. Brenda let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. God, she is such a disaster. But near the entrance of the trauma bay, Dr. Robert Callum stood perfectly still. He had seen the whole thing. He had seen Abigail's eyes. When she stepped up to that table, the timid, frightened nurse had vanished. For exactly 3 seconds, her eyes were dead, cold, and entirely devoid of fear. She hadn't bumped Braxton's arm. She had executed a combat-style rapid decompression with a level of muscle memory that only comes from performing the procedure hundreds of times under extreme, lethal duress. Callum walked back to the central desk. He waited until Nancy was alone. "Nancy," he said quietly, "pull up Abigail Foster's personnel file for me." Nancy frowned, clicking her mouse. "Brenda already snooped. It's pretty thin, Dr. Callum. Says she worked at a place called Sterling Corp in Idaho for 10 years. Outpatient, mostly administrative nursing. Why?" Callum stared down the hallway where Abigail had disappeared. "Sterling Corp," he murmured. The name tickled the very back of his memory. Something connected to his days as an army surgeon 20 years ago. A ghost company. A black-budget contractor. "Just leave the file open, Nancy," Callum said, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. "I have a feeling we don't know who the hell we hired." By 4:15 a.m., the ER had settled into a deceptive, terrifying lull. The gunshot victim was stabilized and upstairs in surgery. The waiting room was mostly empty, occupied only by a few sleeping transients seeking shelter from the biting coastal fog. The silence in the hospital was heavy, pressing against the eardrums, a stark contrast to the earlier chaos. Abigail sat alone in the cramped employee break room, staring blankly at the flickering fluorescent light overhead. Her hands rested flat on the cheap laminate table. She was perfectly still. To a casual observer, she looked exhausted, but internally, her mind was running through a complex series of tactical assessments. She calculated the distance from the break room to the emergency exits. She noted that the backup generator engaged in exactly 4.2 seconds during a power failure. She mentally catalogued the contents of the crash carts, translating standard civilian medical supplies into field-expedient trauma gear. "Stop it," she commanded herself silently. "You are Abigail Foster. You are a civilian. You are safe." She reached up and rubbed the faint, jagged white scar that peeked out from the collar of her scrub top, a permanent souvenir from a mortar shell in the Korengal Valley. She was on mandatory, indefinite medical leave. Her commanding officer, Commander David Sterling, had given her a direct order: disappear, assimilate, and learn how to be a normal human being again before the PTSD completely eroded her sanity. She had chosen this hospital because it was unremarkable, a place to hide in plain sight. Abigail stood up, deciding she needed more of the terrible coffee to maintain her facade of jittery anxiety. As she reached for the glass pot, her hand brushed the edge of a heavy ceramic mug sitting on the counter. The mug tipped, plummeting towards the tile floor. Her reflexes, honed by years of surviving ambushes and close-quarters combat, engaged instantly. Her hand shot down, moving faster than the human eye could comfortably track, catching the heavy mug by the handle less than an inch from the floor. Not a single drop of the cold coffee inside spilled. She froze. Standing in the doorway of the break room was Dr. Robert Callum. He was staring directly at her hand, hovering an inch above the tiles. Abigail's mind raced. She slowly stood up, placing the mug back on the counter, and immediately let out a nervous, high-pitched giggle. "Wow! Lucky catch!" she stammered, pushing her glasses up her nose. "I usually drop everything. Good thing my foot was in the way." Callum didn't smile. He walked slowly into the room, his eyes fixed on her face. "You didn't catch it with your foot, Abigail. I watched you catch it. I've never seen anyone move that fast." "I played softball in high school," she offered weakly, shrinking back against the counter. Callum stopped 2 feet away from her. "Sterling Corp," he said quietly. "I made a few phone calls to some old friends at the Pentagon 20 minutes ago. The main switchboard for Sterling Corp in Idaho goes to an automated voicemail, But when you dial a specific bypass code, it redirects to the Department of Defense, specifically the Joint Special Operations Command. Abigail's heart rate remained completely steady, but her eyes locked onto Callum's. The timid facade didn't drop entirely, but the trembling stopped. "I don't know what you're talking about, Dr. Callum," she whispered. "I just did paperwork." "I was a trauma surgeon in Fallujah," Callum continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know what a combat medic looks like. I know what a warrior looks like trying to pretend they aren't one. The way you check the corners of every room you enter. The way you tied that tourniquet on the MVC victim earlier tonight. That wasn't a Red Cross knot. That was a Ranger standard. Who are you hiding from, Abigail?" Before Abigail could formulate a lie, the radio strapped to Callum's hip crackled to life. It wasn't the standard dispatch frequency. It was a harsh, piercing blast of pure white static, so loud it made both of them wince. Callum grabbed the radio, turning the volume down. "Dispatch, this is Sacred Heart ER. You're broadcasting dead air. Over." More static. Then a voice broke through. It wasn't the bored, nasal tone of the local 911 dispatcher. It was a man's voice, clipped, urgent, and thick with panic. "Broken Arrow. Repeat, Broken Arrow. Convoy compromised on Route 101. Heavy casualties. Hostiles in pursuit. We are diverting to—" The transmission cut off with a squeal of electronic interference. Callum frowned, looking at the radio. "Route 101. That's the coastal highway. Who uses the term Broken Arrow on a civilian dispatch?" Abigail didn't answer. Callum looked up. The grey mouse was gone. Abigail was standing at her full height, her shoulders squared, her jaw clenched tight. The oversized scrubs no longer looked comical. They looked like camouflage. She reached up, pulled the cheap plastic clips out of her hair, and tied it back into a tight, severe knot. "Dr. Callum," she said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying the unmistakable, hard edge of absolute authority. "Does this hospital have an external lockdown protocol?" "Yes, but," Callum stammered, entirely thrown off balance by the sudden, terrifying transformation of the woman in front of him. "Engage it, now!" Abigail ordered, stepping past him towards the door. "Abigail, what is going on? What was that radio call?" Abigail stopped in the doorway and looked back at him. Her eyes were no longer hiding behind the thick lenses. She had pulled the glasses off and tossed them into the trash can. "Broken Arrow means a nuclear weapon has been lost, stolen, or compromised," Abigail said flatly. "But in certain Black Ops communications, it means a high-value military transport has been ambushed and is experiencing a catastrophic loss of life." Callum's blood ran cold. "How do you know that?" Suddenly the lights in the break room flickered violently. The low hum of the hospital's electrical grid whined, then died completely. Plunged into darkness, the backup generators roared to life exactly 4.2 seconds later, bathing the hallways in dim, red emergency lighting. From outside, beyond the thick coastal fog, a new sound began to build. It started as a low, rhythmic vibration that rattled the medical instruments on the stainless steel trays. It grew louder, heavier, a violent thumping that seemed to beat directly against the chest. Callum ran to the window, peering out into the parking lot. "What is that? Are those medevac choppers?" "No," Abigail said, stepping up beside him, her eyes tracking the dark, massive silhouettes dropping out of the fog. "Medevacs don't fly in packs. Those are Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawks, and they're flying dark." The heavy, rhythmic pounding of the rotors shook the foundation of the hospital. Outside, before the helicopters even touched down, 6 unmarked, armored black SUVs tore into the ambulance bay, screeching to a halt and blocking all the civilian exits. "They aren't bringing us patients, Dr. Callum," Abigail said softly, her hand instinctively reaching toward her hip where a sidearm used to be. "They're bringing a war." As the first Black Hawk slammed onto the asphalt, its side doors sliding open to reveal the gleam of assault rifles, Abigail turned to the chief of medicine. "Tell your staff to stay out of the way, and whatever happens in the next 10 minutes, Do exactly as I say." The downdraft from the 8 Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawks hit Sacred Heart Medical Center like a localized Category 4 hurricane. The sheer acoustic violence of the twin-engine turbines shattered the remaining veneer of the hospital's calm, vibrating the heavy reinforced safety glass of the ambulance bay until a spiderweb of cracks began to form. Inside the ER, the red emergency lighting cast long, demonic shadows as unsecured clipboards, empty IV bags, and plastic basins were sucked into the chaotic air currents swirling through the sliding doors, which had been jammed open by the sudden pressure drop. Dr. Kyle Braxton stepped out of Trauma 2, his face a mask of furious indignation. He had been in the middle of writing a post-op report, and the interruption to his focused, self-important workflow was entirely unacceptable. "What in the hell is going on out there?" Braxton roared, trying to be heard over the deafening mechanical roar. He marched towards the triage desk, expecting to find Nancy Gable ready to apologize for the noise. "Did Life Flight mistake our parking lot for a military base? Get security out there right now and clear my landing pad." Nancy wasn't at the desk. She was backed against the wall near the medication dispensary, her hands clamped over her ears, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Before Braxton could yell again, the main sliding doors were violently forced apart. They didn't look like standard paramedics. They didn't look like local SWAT. They moved with a terrifying liquid synchronicity that bespoke years of close-quarters combat. 12 men poured into the triage area. They were clad in unmarked, blood-spattered tactical gear, plate carriers heavy with ceramic armor and spare magazines. Short-barreled assault rifles were tucked tight against their shoulders, sweeping the room with cold green laser sights that cut through the foggy, dust-filled air. The scent of cordite, aviation fuel, and fresh, coppery blood instantly overpowered the hospital's sterile bleach smell. "Clear!" one of the men shouted, his voice muffled by a balaclava and a throat mic. "Main corridor secured. Covering the flanks," another barked, taking a knee near the waiting room and aiming his weapon towards the street-facing windows. Braxton, entirely blinded by his own arrogance and lacking any basic survival instinct, marched directly towards the lead operative. "Excuse me, you cannot bring live firearms into a sterile trauma center. I am the attending physician on this floor, and I order you to—" The lead commando didn't even look at Braxton. Without breaking his stride, the operative simply raised his left forearm and delivered a short, brutal strike to Braxton's chest. The blow, backed by the momentum of 200 pounds of muscle and Kevlar, lifted the arrogant doctor off his feet and sent him crashing into a row of plastic waiting chairs. Braxton crumpled, gasping for air, his ego effectively neutralized in a fraction of a second. "I need the chief of medicine right now!" the lead commando roared, his voice cracking with raw desperation. He pulled off his helmet, revealing a face smeared with soot and blood. Captain David Hayes of the 75th Ranger Regiment was a man who had seen hell on 3 continents. But right now, his eyes betrayed a profound, terrifying panic. "Where is the ranking trauma surgeon?" Dr. Robert Callum stepped out from the hallway leading to the break room, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "I am Dr. Callum, Chief of Emergency Medicine. What do you need, son?" "We have a massive hemorrhage, multiple GSWs, Class 4 hemorrhagic shock," Hayes shouted, waving frantically toward the doors. 4 of his men were sprinting backward into the ER, dragging a folding tactical litter between them. On it lay a man tangled in a mess of field dressings, combat gauze, and pooling blood. He took a 7.62 round right below the plates, severed the femoral. "We have a tourniquet high and tight, but it's slipping. We are losing him." Callum's professional instincts overrode his fear. "Get him into Trauma 1. Nancy, I need the massive transfusion protocol initiated immediately. Page General Surgery. Tell them to prep an OR." "We don't have time for an OR," Hayes snapped, grabbing Callum by the collar of his white coat. "He has minutes. You have to clamp that artery down here right now, or the director is going to bleed out on your floor." I need a vascular surgeon for that, Callum argued, pulling back. I can stabilize, but if the artery is shredded high in the groin, I don't care what you need, Doc. Fix him. From the shadows near the break room, a figure emerged. She walked with a slow, deliberate cadence that completely contrasted the frantic energy of the room. The baggy, seafoam green scrubs no longer looked comical. They looked like the uniform of an apex predator stepping into her domain. Her mousy brown hair was pulled back tight. Her posture was ramrod straight. Abigail Foster stepped into the harsh light of the central station. One of the perimeter guards, a young ranger gripping a light machine gun, turned his head. His eyes locked onto Abigail. His jaw went slack. He immediately lowered his weapon, standing at rigid attention. Captain Hayes turned, ready to scream at the nurse to get out of the way. The words died in his throat. He stared at the woman in the oversized scrubs. He blinked, the adrenaline and panic momentarily stalling as his brain tried to process the impossible sight before him. Hayes released Callum's coat. He stood up straight, his bloody hands dropping to his sides. In the middle of the chaotic, blood-soaked emergency room, ignoring the screaming medical alarms and the terrified civilian staff, Captain David Hayes snapped a crisp, flawless salute to the stuttering, notoriously clumsy new triage nurse. "Angel 6, Hayes breathed, his voice a mixture of awe and profound relief. "We need you." The silence that followed Hayes's salute was absolute, broken only by the ragged, bubbling breathing of the dying man on the tactical litter. Dr. Callum stared at Abigail. Nancy Gable, peeking out from behind the dispensary, dropped a handful of saline flushes onto the floor. Even Braxton, currently groaning on the floor, stopped clutching his ribs to gape at the scene. Abigail didn't salute back. She didn't acknowledge the dramatic shift in the room's dynamic. She simply looked past Hayes and zeroed in on the patient. "Report, Captain," Abigail commanded. Her voice was unrecognizable. The timid, whispering squeak was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, metallic authority that demanded instant compliance. "Target is Director William Cole," Hayes rattled off, his military conditioning instantly snapping back into place under her command. "Ambushed on Route 101. Hostile forces utilized an IED followed by small arms fire. Cole took a 7.62 armor-piercing round to the right pelvic region, bypassing the plates. Massive arterial bleed. 2 units of whole blood administered in the bird, but the tourniquet is failing. ETA on hostile pursuit is less than 5 minutes. "They tracked your birds," Abigail stated, her eyes scanning Cole's pale, sweat-drenched face. "You brought a mobile war zone to a civilian structure." "We had no choice, ma'am," Hayes said grimly. "He wasn't going to make it to the secure facility at Fort Lewis. You were the closest." Abigail didn't waste another second. "Bring him to Trauma 1. Move," she turned to Callum. "Doctor, I need a Reboa catheter kit. 2 rapid infusers primed with O-negative blood, a fully stocked central line kit, and a clamshell tray. Now," Callum blinked. "Abigail, a Reboa is a highly complex endovascular procedure. You need fluoroscopy and a board-certified trauma surgeon. I have done 42 Reboa placements in the dark while taking incoming mortar fire, Robert," Abigail snapped, using his first name with a chilling familiarity. "Get me the kit, or he dies." Callum didn't argue. He sprinted towards the supply closet. The Rangers lifted the litter and practically threw Director Cole onto the main hospital bed in Trauma 1. The sterile room was instantly contaminated by mud, Kevlar, and an impossible amount of blood. Abigail stepped up to the right side of the bed. She didn't bother putting on a protective gown. She snapped a pair of sterile gloves over her hands with a loud crack. "Nancy!" Abigail barked over her shoulder. "Get in here! I need hands!" Nancy Gable, trembling but driven by decades of nursing instinct, ran into the room. "What do you need, Abby?" "Don't call me that," Abigail said, her eyes fixed on Cole's groin, where a tactical tourniquet was desperately biting into the flesh. "I need you to manage the airway. He's agonal breathing. Intubate him. Use a size 8 tube. If you miss, I will critch him with a scalpel." Go." Braxton, having finally dragged himself off the floor, stumbled into the doorway. "You can't do this! You are a registered nurse! This is malpractice! I am taking control of this patient!" Abigail didn't look up. She simply flicked 2 fingers towards the door. Captain Hayes stepped in front of Braxton, placing a heavy, blood-stained hand on the doctor's chest. "Doc," Hayes growled, leaning in close. "The woman standing at that table is Commander Abigail Foster. She is the former Chief Medical Officer for JSOC's premier Black Operations Unit. She has pulled more bullets out of Tier 1 operators than you've prescribed aspirin. If you speak to her again, I will physically throw you through that window. Step back." Braxton paled, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish before he retreated into the hallway. Callum ran in, dropping the specialized REBOA, resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta, kit onto the Mayo stand. "Here." "Cut the pants away," Abigail ordered Hayes. The Ranger drew a combat knife and sliced through the thick tactical fabric. Blood immediately surged upward, a dark, terrifying fountain. The tourniquet had completely failed. "I have no pressure," Nancy yelled from the head of the bed, struggling to secure the breathing tube. "He's flatlining!" "Hold compression!" Abigail yelled to Callum. Callum threw his entire body weight onto Cole's groin, trying to manually pinch the shredded femoral artery against the pelvic bone. The blood merely slipped around his fingers. Abigail opened the REBOA kit. It was a Hail Mary procedure, inserting a balloon catheter into the femoral artery and inflating it high in the aorta to completely block blood flow to the lower half of the body, temporarily stopping the bleeding and keeping the heart and brain oxygenated. Without an ultrasound machine to guide her, it was essentially blind. "Robert, on my count, release pressure. I have 1 shot at the artery before it retracts into the pelvis." Callum gritted his teeth, his hands slick with blood. "Ready? 3, 2, 1. Off." Callum pulled his hands back. A geyser of arterial blood erupted. Abigail didn't flinch. Her left hand plunged directly into the pooling blood, her sensitive fingertips searching through the torn muscle and fascia. "Got it," she muttered. With her right hand, she fed the guide wire of the catheter directly into the severed artery. Her movements were a blur of absolute precision. She threaded the wire, advanced the sheath, and pushed the balloon catheter up into Zone 1 of Cole's descending aorta. "Inflating," she announced, pushing the syringe on the end of the catheter. Instantly, the catastrophic bleeding in Cole's groin slowed to a miserable trickle, then stopped entirely. "Balloon is up," Abigail said, her breathing perfectly controlled. "Nancy, do we have an airway?" "Tube is in. Good bilateral breath sounds," Nancy gasped, squeezing the manual resuscitator bag. "Start the rapid infusers. Push the blood. Give him 1 milligram of epinephrine," Abigail ordered. She looked at the cardiac monitor. The flat red line hitched, spiked, and then fell into a weak, rapid rhythm. "We have a pulse," Callum said, staring at the monitor, his voice shaking. He looked at Abigail's bloody hands. "My God, you did it blind. That was impossible." "It buys us 30 minutes before his lower organs start to die from ischemia," Abigail stated, stripping off her bloody gloves and grabbing a fresh pair. "We need to surgically repair the artery now, or we lose the leg, then his life." Before Callum could prep the surgical tray, a deafening explosion rocked the outside of the hospital. The reinforced glass in the ambulance bay, already fractured by the helicopters, finally gave way, showering the triage desk in thousands of sharp, crystalline fragments. The lights in the trauma bay flickered. The heavy chatter of automatic weapons fire echoed through the damp Portland night, dangerously close. Captain Hayes brought his rifle up, his radio crackling wildly. "Perimeter is engaged. We have multiple hostile vehicles breaching the south entrance. They brought heavy armor." Abigail looked up from the patient, her eyes locking onto Hayes. The grey mouse was dead and buried. Angel 6 had fully awakened. "Captain," Abigail said, her voice slicing through the sounds of gunfire outside, "secure this hallway. Nobody gets through those doors. Robert, prep the vascular clamps. We have a surgery to finish." The heavy, rhythmic thud of a breaching charge detonating at the south entrance reverberated through the very foundation of Sacred Heart Medical Center. The explosion sent a shockwave of dust, pulverized drywall, and the acrid stench of C4 sweeping down the main corridor of the emergency department. The backup generator groaned under the sudden power fluctuation, causing the red emergency lights to strobe violently, casting the unfolding nightmare in a disjointed, cinematic horror. "Hold the line!" Captain Hayes roared over the deafening cacophony. He crouched behind the overturned triage desk, his M4 carbine barking in short, controlled 3-round bursts. Hot brass cascaded onto the linoleum, rolling through puddles of spilled IV fluids and blood. "Do not let them past the double doors! Suppressing fire on the radiology hallway!" 3 of his Rangers, positioned behind a reinforced concrete pillar and an overturned medical supply cart, unleashed a wall of lead down the corridor. The hostiles returning fire were not untrained street thugs or standard cartel hitmen. They moved with the same fluid, terrifying tactical precision as Hayes's men. They utilized bounding overwatch, deploying flashbangs and smoke grenades to obscure their advance. The distinctive suppressed pop-pop-pop of their weapons indicated high-tier, specialized gear. This was a highly orchestrated assassination attempt by a rogue element, and they had cornered their prey in a civilian hospital. Inside Trauma 1, the war outside was reduced to a terrifying, muffled soundtrack. Abigail Foster's world had shrunk to a 6-inch surgical field, illuminated by a single, battery-powered surgical headlamp strapped over her bloody forehead. "We are burning daylight, Robert," Abigail said, her voice an icy calm that sharply contrasted with the frantic shaking of Dr. Callum's hands. "The Reboa balloon has been inflated for 12 minutes. At 30 minutes, Director Cole's kidneys and bowels begin to die. I need vascular clamps on the proximal and distal ends of the lacerated femoral artery, right now." Callum swallowed hard, wiping a bead of sweat from his eye with his bicep to avoid contaminating his sterile gloves. He peered into the mess of torn flesh and pooling blood. "I have the proximal end," he grunted, clamping down with a pair of heavy stainless steel hemostats. "The distal end is retracted. I can't see it through the hematoma." Abigail didn't hesitate. She plunged her fingers deeper into the wound, bypassing the severed muscle fibers. Her fingertips, stripped of the thick latex gloves and now wearing only thin, ultra-sensitive nitrile, searched blindly. "Got it," she murmured. She grabbed a second clamp from the Mayo stand and secured the lower half of the shredded artery. "Nancy," Abigail barked, not looking up. "I need a 5-0-proline suture, a heparin flush, and the Castroviejo needle drivers. If we don't stitch this anastomosis perfectly, the pressure will blow it apart the second I deflate the balloon in his aorta." Nancy Gable, a woman who had spent 20 years managing drunk teenagers and minor car accidents, was currently acting as the scrub tech for a Black Ops field surgery. She fumbled with the sterile packaging, but managed to slap the needle drivers into Abigail's waiting palm. "Here, Abby, Commander, his blood pressure is dropping again. The infuser is pushing the 3rd unit of O-negative, but it's not enough. Push 1 ampule of calcium chloride to counteract the citrate in the banked blood, and give him another milligram of EPI," Abigail commanded, her hands a blur of micro-movements as she began to stitch the 2 ends of the artery together. Outside the heavy wooden doors of the trauma bay, the firefight intensified. A terrifyingly close explosion shattered the glass observation window of the adjacent operating room. Shrapnel embedded itself into the drywall just inches from Nancy's head. She screamed, ducking below the patient's bed. "Keep your eyes on the monitor, Nancy," Abigail snapped, her hands never stopping their intricate, life-saving dance. "Fear is a distraction. You do not have time for it. Suture scissors, Robert." Callum snipped the blue proline thread. "Abigail, they sound like they're right outside." He wasn't wrong. Out in the hallway, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. A flashbang grenade rolled past the triage desk, detonating with a blinding flash of white light and a concussive boom that temporarily deafened Hayes and his men. In the ensuing disorientation, 2 hostiles clad in heavy black armor breached the perimeter, sprinting past the suppressive fire and kicking open the door to the medication dispensary. Brenda Higgins, who had been hiding beneath the counter since the first helicopter landed, let out a piercing shriek as a mercenary aimed a rifle with a laser sight directly at her chest. "Clear!" the mercenary yelled to his partner, ignoring the terrified nurse to scan the room for the target. "He's not here! Try the trauma bays!" The second mercenary turned toward Trauma 1. He raised his heavy steel-toed boot and kicked the heavy double doors with enough force to splinter the lock mechanism. Inside, Abigail was tying off the final knot on the femoral artery. "Heparin flush, Robert. Let's check for leaks." The doors burst open. The mercenary stepped into the room, his rifle raised. He took in the scene. The bloody patient, the terrified older doctor, the cowering charge nurse. And then, his laser sight settled squarely on the center of Abigail's chest, painting a bright green dot on her seafoam green scrubs. "Step away from the table," the hostile ordered, his voice mechanically distorted through a tactical mask. Callum froze, his hand still holding the clamps. Nancy sobbed quietly from the floor. Abigail slowly raised her hands, stepping back from the operating table. The timid, clumsy persona of the new nurse was a ghost, replaced entirely by the lethal, calculating presence of Angel 6. "You're making a tactical error," Abigail said smoothly, her eyes locking onto the mercenary's visor. "Shut up. Step against the wall," the man growled, advancing a step toward the bed to confirm the target. "You breached a fatal funnel," Abigail continued, her voice hypnotic, perfectly steady. "You didn't clear the corners, and you assumed the personnel in this room were unarmed non-combatants." The mercenary frowned beneath his mask. "What are you talking about?" "Robert," Abigail said, her eyes never leaving the hostile. "Drop." Callum, operating purely on survival instinct, threw himself flat onto the blood-slicked floor. In a fraction of a second, the scene exploded into violence. Abigail didn't reach for a gun. She reached for the heavy stainless steel surgical retractor sitting on the edge of the Mayo stand. With a brutal, practiced flick of her wrist, she hurled the heavy instrument directly at the mercenary's face. The heavy steel smashed into the reinforced glass of his tactical goggles, cracking the lens and disorienting him just long enough for his finger to jerk on the trigger. A burst of gunfire chewed into the ceiling tiles, showering the room in acoustic dust. Before the man could recover and lower his weapon, Abigail closed the distance. She moved with a terrifying, predatory speed. She stepped inside the arc of his rifle barrel, her left hand violently slapping the hot weapon away from her body. Her right hand, still gripping the razor-sharp No. 10 surgical scalpel she had used to cut the sutures, drove upward. She bypassed his ceramic chest plate and the thick Kevlar collar, finding the unprotected gap just beneath the jawline. With surgical, lethal precision, she severed the hostile's carotid artery and crushed his windpipe in a single, fluid motion. The mercenary dropped his rifle, his hands flying to his throat as he collapsed backward, choking on his own blood. Abigail didn't watch him fall. She immediately spun around, grabbed a fresh pair of sterile gloves from the wall dispenser, and snapped them on. She stepped back over the dying mercenary, picked up the dropped syringe of heparin, and walked back to the operating table. "Get up, Robert," she ordered, her voice devoid of any emotion. "We have a balloon to deflate. Nancy, I need you back on the bag. Squeeze." Dr. Callum slowly pushed himself off the floor, his face entirely drained of color. He stared at the dead, heavily armored man bleeding out on the linoleum, then looked at Abigail, who was casually flushing the repaired artery. "Who? What are you?" Callum whispered, his voice trembling. "I am Angel 6, Abigail replied softly, looking down at the surgical field, "and I am deflating the riboa now. Watch the pressure." As Abigail slowly withdrew the fluid from the riboa catheter balloon, a tense silence fell over Trauma 1, punctuated only by the dying echoes of gunfire outside and the frantic beeping of the cardiac monitor. "Balloon is down," Abigail announced. Callum held his breath, watching the sutured femoral artery. The vessel pulsed violently as a massive surge of blood rushed back into Director Cole's lower extremities. The blue proline stitches stretched, but they held. Not a single drop of blood leaked from the anastomosis. "The repair is holding," Callum gasped, a massive wave of relief washing over him. Circulation is restored to the leg. Blood pressure is stabilizing at 100/60. "He's still critical, but he won't bleed to death on this table," Abigail said, quickly applying a heavy pressure dressing over the surgical site. "Good work, Robert. Nancy, keep pushing oxygen." Suddenly, the staccato rhythm of the firefight outside shifted. The distinctive heavy thud of a .50 caliber machine gun, mounted on a heavily armored vehicle, tore through the night, followed by the wail of dozens of police sirens. Captain Hayes burst through the shattered doorway of the trauma bay, his face smeared with soot, his armor chipped and ruined. "Cavalry is here," he panted, lowering his weapon. "Local SWAT and a quick reaction force from Fort Lewis just hit their flanks. The hostiles are retreating. The hospital is secure. How is the director?" "He's stable," Abigail replied, stepping away from the table and pulling off her bloody gloves. "But he needs a proper ICU and a course of broad-spectrum antibiotics immediately. His vascular system was open to a non-sterile environment for 30 minutes. Hayes looked at the dead mercenary on the floor, the surgical scalpel still protruding from his neck. He then looked up at Abigail, profound respect etched into his exhausted features. "You saved him, Commander. You saved all of us." "Just doing my job, Captain," Abigail said quietly. Within 20 minutes, Zahn, the ER was flooded with state police, federal agents, and military personnel. The chaos of the gunfight was replaced by the organized, bureaucratic chaos of a post-incident lockdown. Director Cole was heavily sedated and loaded into a specialized, heavily armored military ambulance under the guard of 20 Rangers. Doctor Kyle Braxton emerged from his hiding spot in a supply closet, his white coat pristine, trying immediately to take charge of the triage efforts for the wounded police officers. He spotted Abigail standing near the sinks, washing the dried blood from her forearms. Braxton marched over, attempting to salvage his shattered ego. "Foster, you abandoned your post. Do you have any idea the amount of paperwork this is going to generate? You are completely unmanageable. I am recommending to HR that you be terminated immediately for insubordination and—" A heavy hand clamped onto Braxton's shoulder, spinning him around. Dr. Robert Callum stood there, his scrubs soaked in blood, a look of pure, unadulterated fury on his face. "Kyle," Callum said, his voice dangerously low, "if you ever speak to this woman again, I will personally see to it that your medical license is revoked, your career is ended, and you are blacklisted from every hospital on the West Coast. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Braxton stammered, his eyes darting between Callum's furious glare and Abigail's cold, indifferent stare. Yes, Dr. Callum. Perfectly clear." He scurried away, finally defeated. Callum turned back to Abigail. She had dried her arms and was currently shrugging off the oversized, blood-stained scrub top, revealing a fitted black tactical undershirt beneath. She reached into her locker, pulled out a dark canvas duffel bag, and slung it over her shoulder. "You're leaving," Callum stated, though it wasn't a question. "My cover is blown, Robert," Abigail said, adjusting the strap of her bag. "Sterling Corp will wipe my employment records here by sunrise. It will be like Abigail Foster never existed." "Where will you go?" Nancy asked, walking up beside Callum, tears welling in her eyes. "You're a brilliant nurse, Abby. The best I've ever seen. You belong here." Abigail offered a small, sad smile, the first genuine emotion she had shown all night. "I don't belong in the light, Nancy. I belong in the shadows. It's the only place I know how to breathe." She extended a hand to Callum. He took it, shaking it firmly. "It was an honor to operate with you, Commander." "Keep saving lives, Doctor," Abigail replied. Without another word, Angel 6 turned and walked down the shattered, debris-filled hallway of the emergency department. She bypassed the barricades, slipped past the swarming federal agents, and stepped out into the damp, freezing coastal night. The thick Portland fog was rolling back in, thick and grey. Abigail Foster pulled the collar of her jacket up against the chill, took 3 steps into the mist, and simply vanished, leaving behind only whispers, a saved life, and a story that no one at Sacred Heart Medical Center would ever truly believe. What a breathtaking, adrenaline-pumping ride! The story of Angel 6 proves that the most extraordinary heroes often hide in plain sight, disguised in oversized scrubs and clumsy personas. From the heart-stopping medical procedures to the intense, tactical hospital siege, Abigail Foster's transition from a timid triage nurse to a lethal Tier 1 operative is a testament to the hidden strength of those who serve in the shadows. If this incredible, action-packed medical thriller kept you on the edge of your seat and left your heart racing, do us a massive favor. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with your friends who love intense real-life drama and military stories, and make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell. We have so many more gripping, unbelievable stories to tell, and you won't want to miss a single one. Drop a comment below. Would you have guessed Abigail's secret?